Okay, let's see, conflict of interest. I have no conflicts of interest. I'm basically speaking here to you in an effort to promote the safer use of wireless technology and also encourage competition for safety in the tech industry. As they mentioned, I work for the Environmental Health Trust and I encourage you to visit our site, ehtrust.org. We have a lot of helpful information and I hope you find it useful. So the emphasis on today's talk is on cell towers, and you've no doubt seen them in your communities. They're absolutely everywhere. They started being built during COVID, I think, or maybe a little bit beforehand. But we have masts, cell phone masts. We have the towers that are emitting 5G frequency, the small cells. And you may walk by them and think that they're not doing anything, but if you have a detector, you'll pick up that they're emitting radiation. And in this video, I'm using a detector that picks up the high band frequency of the 5G network. I'm across the street on the stoop of a house across one of these cells, and I'm getting maximum intensity values of over 10,000 microwatts per meter squared, which is very significant. Before we can really understand why this is damaging our health, we need to understand that we are electromagnetic beings and we have evolved on Earth with cyclical patterns of light and darkness. And because of that, we've got all this physiology that is entrained to the Earth's rotation. I want to bring your attention to the one on the bottom, melanin production. That's important because what melanin is, it's a chromophore, it's a chemical in our skin, and it actually absorbs light frequencies, diffuses that energy, and then we emit that extra energy out into the environment as infrared radiation. So we are biologically protected from the deeper penetrations of light energy coming from the sun. We're talking about electromagnetic radiation, and the electromagnetic spectrum is a continuum of radiation representing different frequencies from 1 cycle per second, or 1 hertz, all the way up to gamma radiation. And the sun is exposing us to a certain bandwidth, including the visible light spectrum, which represents the vertically oriented rainbow here, as well as infrared radiation and the UVA and some UVB radiation. Everything to the right of the sun is considered ionizing radiation, and that we know is dangerous. It has enough energy it has enough energy to knock an electron out of an atom's orbit, depending on the binding affinity that electron has for its atom. To the left of the sun, we have non-ionizing radiation, which doesn't have that much energy, but it does have biological effects. Our technology is using this bandwidth in the megahertz and gigahertz frequencies. And the problem is we're not turning it off. The sun sets, but our technology stays on. And it's almost as if we're living in a world now with 2 suns. One sun's emitting lower frequencies, but it never sets. So what is that doing to our communities? We're going to find out. These antennas are popping up, as I mentioned, everywhere. Typically, they look like a triangle, and it's because each of the antennas are oriented at 120 degrees off axis to one another, so they can provide circumferential coverage. They're oriented towards the Earth at some distance so that the user can get the frequency. And these are emitting pulsations of radiation. It's not a steady stream of radiation. It's an erratic pulsation. They call it electromagnetic radiation because it's actually 2 intersecting waves. One is an electric field and one's a magnetic field. Now, I did a study when they started installing these back in 2020, and I found that the communities that had the new 5G, 4G LTE networks were exposing their population to between 10 and 100 times the amount of radiation on their main streets than the older networks. That was one of the things that got me totally panicked about this whole situation and got me to write a book, which I'll talk about later. So what is this radiation doing to our wildlife and the trees? Well, trees can't move. So if they're stationary and they're in a line of sight to one of these antennas, they're going to experience something called crown death. You've more than likely seen this in your communities. It can take years. This is an example of a tree that was a certain distance from this antenna that was placed on a building top, and you can see that over the years, a larger and larger portion of the tree has died. How is this happening? It's a process that is initiated by the depolarization of the cell membranes. So the radiation penetrates into the organism, whether it's a plant or an animal. It causes the membranes to depolarize. And what happens is the ion channels in the cell membrane can open up. And one of them in particular is the voltage-gated calcium channels. When that opens up, calcium can influx into the cell and cause an imbalance in the cell's interior. That can result in something called the production of reactive oxygen species. They're oxygen-containing molecules that are unstable. They're looking for an extra pair of electrons. And in a normal state, your cell has an antioxidant called glutathione. It's the master antioxidant. And so glutathione generously donates its electrons to the reactive oxygen species, and you get balance back in the cell. But if you have continual exposure to a toxin over and over and over, minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, your glutathione will become depleted. And then what happens is these reactive oxygen species start looking elsewhere for their electrons. If they take electrons from lipids in the cell membrane, those lipids can become peroxidized, and they become deformed, and it compromises the integrity of the cell membrane. If the electrons come from proteins or enzymes made of proteins, those proteins can become denatured. I will point out that we have a lot of diseases now in our society, such as ALS, Lewy body dementia, Parkinson's, et cetera. They're all caused by abnormal protein aggregates. Protein aggregation is a sequela of protein denaturation. If the electrons are taken from DNA, we can end up with mutagenesis and carcinogenesis. And if the electrons are taken from mitochondria, we can end up with mitochondrial dysfunction. How do we know if DNA is damaged? Well, there's a study called gel electrophoresis, and this is an example. And what you're doing is you're labeling the DNA with a fluorescein dye, and you're putting on a gel under a current. And if the DNA is intact, it'll all kind of stay together and result in a ball of fluorescence. But if the DNA becomes fragmented, those fragments of DNA are smaller, they'll travel farther on the gel than the intact DNA. And that's what you're seeing in the middle and the right-sided images. Now, the middle image was obtained when they exposed the DNA to ionizing radiation, gamma radiation, to the equivalent of, I think it says 1,600 chest x-rays, so a lot of radiation. We would expect that. But what we wouldn't expect is that when we exposed the DNA to a cell phone for 24 hours, well within the FCC limits, it also fragmented. Now that's an in vitro study, but we've also seen that studies have come out showing that people who live within the vicinity of a cell tower, in this study it was within 80 meters of a cell tower, they experienced damage to the DNA in the peripheral blood leukocytes, which is a type of white blood cell, very important for immune system. So we're impacting our immune system. Now, the National Toxicology Program was given $25 million. It was a 10-year study, and they found that there was an increased risk in the animals that were exposed to the cell phone radiation. They developed brain tumors in the form of gliomas. I'm sure we've all heard of people now who are developing glioblastoma. It's the most aggressive form of brain cancer. Unfortunately, we're seeing it way too common now. These animals also developed schwannomas in their hearts. They had DNA damage, and they showed they had lower body weight in their offspring. The conclusions of the NTP study was that the International Agency for Research on Cancer was right in that cell phone radiation is possibly carcinogenic. But I don't want you to focus only on carcinogenicity. There's also neurological and behavioral effects. So they've done rodent studies, and they've shown that the animals become anxious and depressed when put in these radiation fields. And it reminds me of what we're seeing with our children. And we're all talking about The Anxious Generation, that book by Jonathan Haidt, and how he's correlating screen time and social media to these mood disorders in our children. And my suspicion is that it's not just the screen time and the social media, but it's actually the carrier signal. It's the RF that's being emitted by their devices. And I wonder if they were using hardwired devices, would they still be suffering from this anxiety? I don't think so. I really don't. Our children are also experiencing memory damage, and that has also been shown to occur in the animals when they're exposed to the RF radiation. And we've put cell towers on our schools and on our school playgrounds, and there's been studies that have shown that the students who are exposed to these cell towers are experiencing defects in their spatial memory, a delayed fine and gross motor skills, and also a decreased attention span, exactly the opposite of what you want in your student population. The students are not the only things that are getting confused, so I want you to see this quick video that was put out in CNN. Can we turn the volume up?
Radiation from mobile phones could be part of the problem. Researchers fitted mobile phones to a hive and powered them up for 2 15-minute periods each day. After 3 months, they found the bees stopped producing honey, egg production by the queen bee halved, and the size of the hive dramatically reduced. I spoke to an independent scientist in the UK about how the bees might have been affected. He pointed out that bees have a pigment called cryptochrome.
Animals, including insects, use cryptochrome for navigation. They use it to sense the direction of the Earth's magnetic field. And its ability to do this is compromised by the radiation from mobile phones and their base stations. So basically, bees do not find their way back to the hive.
Dr. Goldsworthy has written to the UK communications regulator Ofcom suggesting they change the phone frequencies so bees won't be confused.
That was very interesting, but bees are not the only animals that have cryptochromes. In fact, we have them too. They're on our retina. And we have a pathway that goes from our eye to the brain that tells our brain when the sun's out in the sky and when it's dark, and that's what tells our brain to produce melatonin. And what's interesting is that we're aware that our light at night, if you look at a blue screen, we're all aware that the blue light is affecting our melatonin production. But what you may not be realizing is that the sources of radiation that you have in your bedroom, perhaps it's a wireless speaker, your cell phone, a Wi-Fi router, it could also be coming from a source outside, like an outdoor antenna. It's affecting you while you're sleeping. And research has shown that circadian rhythms and melatonin production are also affected by RF radiation. In fact, it really doesn't take much. Very low and weak EMR fields have been associated with this impact. So an article recently came out in the New York Times, and the journalist said that radio frequency radiation doesn't even penetrate the skin. And I thought, how could anybody write something so ridiculous? But before I get into that, I just want to say what does happen is the radiation hits an interface, some of it is reflected back, but the rest of it's absorbed, and it goes deeper and deeper into the skin. And as it does, it becomes attenuated. And the point at which the radiation has lost 37% of its initial intensity, that's called the penetration depth. And so you'll hear some people say, oh, well, the penetration depth of this frequency is only 3 or 4 millimeters. But what they're telling you is that that's the point where you only have 63% of the radiation left, and to go even deeper. So the penetration is dependent on the frequency. The higher the frequency, the less penetration, and the lower the frequency, the greater penetration. That's for a given intensity. If you increase the intensity, you're going to have greater penetration. The penetration depth doesn't change, but the amount of radiation that gets deposited into deeper tissues does increase. As a radiologist, I have to say this. Of course, radiofrequency radiation penetrates the skin. That's how we get MRIs. You're putting a patient in a magnetic field, and you hit them with radiofrequency radiation that penetrates through your body, and the little protons in your body emit a sound, and it gets sent back to the computer, and it produces an image. And of course, we have microwaves also, which wouldn't work if radiation didn't penetrate past the skin. So anyway. This was a study done on bees. They sectioned the bees and they showed that at a certain frequency, which is within the 5G bandwidth, there was maximum absorption of the animals with energy. And so that's another thing that might be causing damage to our bees. We can't section people. So how do we determine how much radiation is penetrating? We use modeling studies. And this is an example of a modeling study that was done in Brazil. This was a simulation of a child looking at a tablet, and you can see that the radiation penetrates into the face and then into the brain. Now, children are at particular risk for radiation, and it's for several reasons. One is they have greater water content, and so because of the physics and the electrical properties of the tissue, it allows deeper penetration of the radiation. Also, the nervous systems are not fully developed. They don't have as much myelin, so they're more vulnerable. And particularly important is that children are small. And so if you're considering depth of penetration and how deep is the radiation going, an adult who might have a few centimeters of body fat on their body might attenuate the radiation before it hits a vital structure, whereas a child, it would penetrate into their organs. Now, this was a study that I did earlier this year, and it's really, really important in my opinion. What I did was I looked at the impact of a cell phone on somebody's blood. Now, a lot of people have described rouleau formation on using dark field microscopy, but that was not considered convincing enough for the skeptics. But I had heard back when I was doing my training in the 90s that rouleau formation was something that you could see with ultrasound, and it was associated with disease states such as hypergammaglobulinemia and multiple myeloma and certain forms of cancer. So it was something that I hardly ever saw early on in my career. So what we did was we looked at the popliteal vein on the back of somebody's leg with an ultrasound transducer, and this obliquely oriented dark band is that vein. It's almost normal. I'm going to say for the purposes of this discussion, it is normal in that you're not seeing the blood. It doesn't mean that the vein is empty. The blood cells are just floating freely in the plasma, and they're too small for the sound beam to actually reflect and cause an echo. And that's why the vessel looks black. So we put the cell phone in the back of the knee for 5 minutes and then repeated the study. And look what happened to the blood. Now what you're looking at is aggregated blood. It's all stuck together in a slurry, and it's called rouleau formation. Now this is significant. It's a pathologic hematologic state. It's not permanent. It does seem to improve after 60 or 90 minutes. But if you keep getting exposed over and over again, you are not in a healthy way. There's the risk of stroke. There's a risk of heart attack. I'm not sure what else there is. It might be that there's a risk of decreased metabolism. Perhaps low birth weight infants might be related to this because the oxygen delivery might be impaired. You need to have free-floating blood cells because you want to have maximum surface area for gas exchange. And if the blood cells are all stuck to each other, that's going to impact your gas exchange. So this is very important. And we've done more studies since this. We've looked at 40 people, and believe it or not, almost half the population is walking around with some degree of rouleau. So guys, I would not put a cell phone in your pocket. Women, do not put a cell phone in your bra, please, or in your pocket. I had this come across my desk, my work desk just a few weeks ago. I was reading a scrotal ultrasound, and you can see that this man, in the vein of his scrotum, he's in rouleau formation. So I didn't ask him if he was carrying a cell phone in his pocket, but I'm sure he was. But I just want to impress upon you that this is real. It's happening in the community, and and it's not limited to the leg. There's a whole list of conditions that have been associated with radiofrequency radiation, and you would expect that because this is a non-selective agent. It's not like having a chemical in your body that's going to react with certain organs or compounds. It's non-selective, but unfortunately, regardless of the thousands and thousands of papers that have been written, the scientific community at large, the industry, and our regulators don't consider any of this to be valid because they're stuck in this paradigm that the only thing that non-ionizing radiation can do is cause heat. It's not true. So the bottom line is we're talking about energy, and it's affecting the health of the population. This is not scientific controversy. It's really a political and it's a financial situation. We're talking about $1 trillion industry that's been fabricated on a lie. And I don't know how we're going to get ourselves out of this, but we really need to figure out how we're going to do that. The FCC, as we know, has been a captured agency, and Children's Health Defense and the Environmental Health Trust successfully sued them with the help of Scott McCullough, who's going to be on stage here in just a few minutes. And they won, but the FCC still hasn't updated their standard limits, their standards. They're using standards from 1996, before we even had smartphones. We're trying to get the industry to compete on safety. You know, Volvo was the first car manufacturer to install seatbelts in their cars, and it wasn't a mandate. But of course, now every car has seatbelts. So we're looking for that industry partner to start creating safe technology and to try to turn the tide here. There's a lot you can do to take action, but the first thing I recommend is that you improve your personal use of this technology and create a place in your home where you can get away from it. And Peter Sullivan has a tent out in the lobby that's shielded with EMF repelling fabric. I suggest you go into it and make sure you remove any wearables or don't bring your cell phone in there. Just check it out and see how it feels. You may need one in your house, depending on where you live, if you're being exposed to outdoor antennas and you can't clear the energy from your bedroom. So thank you very much for your attention. If you found this talk interesting, I encourage you to check out Deborah Davis's book, The New Expanded Version of Disconnect. It's an excellent read. She's a fabulous author. And I have a book coming out in June that's going to be published by Children's Health Defense called Unplugged, and I hope you check it out if you want. Thank you.